Welcome. It's just gone 7 p.m, Wednesday, the 25th of August, and you are watching episode 20 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight to the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Education and its Regression, is my guest, Dr. Kevin Donnelly, Senior Research Fellow at the Faculty of Education and Arts and the PM Institute of the Australian Catholic University. He is one of Australia's leading conservative authors and commentator who writes regularly for the Australian, Daily Telegraph and Herald Sun, while he also appears regularly on Sky News. Dr. Donnelly co-chaired the review of the Australian National Curriculum in 2014. He first warned about the dangers of Neo-Marxist inspired political correctness in the mid-90s, and he is a staunch defender of Western civilization, Judaeo-Christianity, and is rigorous education. His most recent book is Cancel Culture and the Left's Long March. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Bill, for having me on the show.
We both entered the education system in the same decade, and we each obviously got different things out of the opportunities afforded us. Can we start with your school experience and what influence it made in your career and life choices?
Yeah, I grew up in Melbourne, in Broadmeadows, which in the day was mainly housing commission, and it was pretty country back then. So we used to go rabbiting and put down the ferrets and be like country kids, ride the bikes, swim in the river. We had a lot of freedom. But I went to Broadmeadows High School, and it was a time when teachers were teachers. The men wore suits, ties and suits. The women had to be properly dressed. And there was strong discipline. The way they taught was very traditional. And that was great for me because at home, Dad was an alcoholic, and what we call the demon drink took over with him. And so at home it was pretty rough, and he used to beat up on Mum. So when I got to school, I was happy to be there, and I realised that if I wanted a different life to my mum and dad, if I wanted to do the right thing and get married and have children, I'd need to have a good career, go to university, study hard, which is what I did. So I was lucky. A lot of kids, when I went to school, left at year 10, and that's great. I had no problem. A lot of them did an apprenticeship or joined the bank or the post office, and they've had a very good life. But I went on to university because I had a couple of teachers, and I loved English, who mentored me at school. I ended up becoming an English teacher. So I went to La Trobe University back in the day and did dip ed, and they used to pay us back then. I was on a studentship. That was the only way I could afford it. But for me, education was a way out, and it opened a whole door, a whole world to me about literature and art and music, and I've always appreciated that.
I think the other thing is we both saw the same things in schools in regards to, as you were saying, the standard address, and also just the way you address the teachers. And when the principal came into the classroom for some reason, it was always acknowledged. And I do have memories of some teachers, not all of them. I distinctly remember my first grade teacher, Miss Venicombe, because she gave me the ruler a few times. And I also remember my grade 7 teacher, Mr. Ma, who was a brilliant maths teacher and sort of gave me an interest in mathematics, more so than, I wasn't very good at English anyway, but I did start to sort of really look into maths a lot more and excel in that. So individual teachers can, as you say, provide some influence in your direction in the future. But of course, by the time my children went to school, and dynamics had completely changed. Teachers were now not as well dressed in some schools, in the high schools, and there was also, we had this system where people are now looking, or even in the 80s and 90s, people were looking at schools outside their area to send their kids in because they perceived some high schools weren't as good as others. So the standard in each school, it started to vary a bit. Is that something you found with your later generations?
You're right, Bill, and I'm not saying we can go back to what it was. It's very hard to kind of unscramble the egg and go back to what we had in the past. But when I was at Broadmeadows and I then went on to Melbourne High, we had, I think it was proficiency, intermediate, leaving, and then matriculation for year 12. So back in the day, we had at year 9, 10, 11, 12, we actually had a syllabus. Teachers were told what they should teach, and they liked that because it gave them a good direction on what they were supposed to be doing in the classroom. But we were also had regular testing, so you could work out whether kids were learning or not. The kids who had trouble, you could give them extra help. So it was a system that worked pretty well. And we also had inspectors who would come regularly and check what was happening in the classroom and what the teachers were up to. Now, over the years, all of that's gone. So when you look at our kids around Australia, the first time they do an examination is in year 12, generally. Now, I'd argue that's too late because a lot of kids are kind of floating through school, not picking up the basics, and they get to year 12 or they get a job and it's too late. The other point is when I was teaching, I was a teacher, I'd stand at the front of the room, I would instruct, I would teach. I'd also let kids work it out and work in groups and give them stuff to go on with. But what's happened now, and it's been there for a fair while, is that teachers no longer teach anymore. They're facilitators, they're guides. It's all about the kids deciding what they want to do. And it's all about, in primary school now, open classrooms, mixed ability teaching. Kids are often on the floor, on their iPads, because they think technology is going to help. So it's a totally different way of teaching. And when you look internationally, those stronger performing countries like Finland, even England now, but certainly Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, those countries have a more traditional approach to teaching, and teachers are in control. One of the problems we have in Australia is, if you look internationally, we have one of the highest rates of classroom disruption, poor discipline, and that's a real issue because if teachers are spending all their time on discipline, they're not actually teaching their subject. So there's a lot that needs to change if we're going to improve.
Do you think it's also the teachers will have to pick up a lot of the roles of parents over the years, because more and more parents, both of them are working, and it seems that some parents have the expectations that some of their jobs need to be done by teachers. And that's something that sort of would have entered into the scheme a little bit more towards the 80s when there was more and more women going into the workforce. So you would have taught into the 80s, just up into the 90s.
Yeah.
So when did you notice any sort of changes as you taught in regards to this expectations placed on the teachers?
I mean, when I first started teaching in the late 70s and the 80s, I was a secondary school teacher, and the job I had was to teach English. So I had to teach kids how to structure a sentence, how to write an essay. I would teach literature like poetry and reading plays or novels. So really, 95% of my time was actually teaching my subject. But when I reviewed the national curriculum in 2014, we had hundreds of submissions from teachers, especially in primary school, saying that they have to talk about stranger danger, water safety, diet, healthy eating, cyberbullying. It just went on and on and on, that all the stuff parents used to do, now the school and teachers were expected to cover. And what that meant was it all became too complicated and too difficult.
One of the other things too is when even up to the 70s and maybe into the 80s, the primary school teachers used to have teachers' colleges for primary school teachers. That got phased out probably in the 80s or 90s to where it's all university trained. And I'm not sure that's been a great success. Do you think there's a role to maybe bring back teachers' college where just for those early primary years where you get people who are completely just focused on that skill set and have that particular interest with young children to deliver that part of the education?
I do, Bill, and I think it was during the Whitlam government that Dawkins was the Minister for Education. And he actually put out a green paper, government policy, where they shut down all the teachers' colleges around Australia. And that was a terrible thing to do, because I can remember when I was at Melbourne High, a couple of my teachers would actually be working at the teachers' college, and they were teaching the teachers. And because they were also working in a school, they had a great idea of what had to be done. But when they closed down all the teaching colleges, they became university faculties, departments of education. A lot of the people working there have never taught in a school. They're academics. Now that's well and good, you can be an academic. But if you're going to teach young teachers who are going into the job, to the profession, you have to be like an apprentice, an apprenticeship, where they have to get a hands-on experience of how to manage kids, how to run a classroom, how to teach properly. So I'd argue one of the terrible things that happened all those years ago was to get rid of teachers' colleges and to actually shift it all to university, where it's all now very theoretical and there's not enough practice about what makes a good teacher.
I think that's part of the teachers' college situation was because actually it stayed around for into the 90s with TAFE teaching. I think the Hawthorn College of Teaching stayed around for TAFE teachers for a fair while. And basically that was there for people who had been in trades and that, maybe in the military or something like that, and they'd picked up a trade and then they wanted to go and teach in the TAFE, those vocational courses. They needed to go to the teachers' college so they could actually present the lectures, learn the skill to actually present the lectures and all that format. So it was a great skill set to have for delivery. And I think at the same time, we all moving to the university for things. We also took nursing, whereas we used to have hospitals training nurses. They might have been as young as 16 or so. They were in dormitories, and there was night gates and all those sort of things to keep the riffraff out from their quarters and that. But they were learning on the job from 16 as nurses' aides and things like that, and then went on to a good career. But now, like teachers, it's all been put into the universities, and no disrespect to university people, but sometimes for the first year or so, you're really just having a good party rather than getting down to the serious nitty gritty, I think. So that might be a bit of a problem.
It is, and as I said,
So how did you
when
find
you
the
do, when you
first
do,
years of university?
sorry, Bill.
How did you find the first? How did you find the first years of university? Were you straight into it, or there was a bit of partying on the side?
Yeah, well, I went to La Trobe University here in Melbourne, and it had only been there for 2 or 3 years. And it was a great experience. It was a pretty radical time. You know, you might remember people our age. It was a time of the Vietnam moratoriums. Jim Cairns, you know, was organising moratoriums around Australia. There was the anti-war movement. I remember there was a festival in America, Woodstock, where there was a lot of music, a lot of drugs. There was what they call the counterculture movement, hippies. People started to wear long hair and Afghani coats, and if you wanted to, smoke a bit of marijuana. And I remember, you know, the demonstrations, one of the placards was "Make love, not war." And a lot of people took that seriously back in the day. So first year uni, that was all starting to happen. So luckily I kept my head down and kept studying, but I did have a bit of trouble in the second year when I discovered hockey. I love sports, so I started to play hockey and meet the boys on the weekend and enjoy training during the week. And there was this whole radical movement to sort of take to the streets and become very left wing. And I kind of followed that for a while until I realised there was no future in it, and that in fact what we were doing was really causing more damage than actually doing anything positive. So in the end, I finished my degree and debated, got married and became a teacher. And a couple of years later, joined what I thought was a conservative party, the Liberal Party, which is no longer conservative. But that's my side of politics. I'm on that conservative side now.
So for a time there, you were Victorian president of the Victorian Secondary Teachers Association. Now we've got the Education Union. Is there a vastly different, or has outlook of those organisations changed over that time? Like when you were there, did you have a clear set purpose, and it's different from what the union's purpose is now?
When you look at what was the Victorian Secondary Teachers Association back in the day, when that began, it was about teachers' conditions of work, about salaries, about how many classes they could teach, how many kids in a classroom. It was all more like a union that was looking after the workers. Now, I have no problem with that, but during the 80s and 90s, the teacher union in Victoria, but it also happened around Australia, became very neo-Marxist, very left-wing, and that's only got a lot worse. So the union for 20, 30 years now has been very left-wing. During the Howard government, when he was Prime Minister, the union argued that kids should go on strike against the war in Iraq. The union now says kids should go on strike to stop climate change. The union is very left-wing. They want to stop funding Catholic and independent schools. It's more like a radical union caught up with all of these policies that are like the Green Party. So they're no longer really acting as a professional union to look after teachers.
So basically they've picked up a thread on ideology and they're pushing that, and that's been brought into the classroom as well as within their hierarchy.
You're dead right, and it's not just the union. I was a member of the English Teachers Association. I mean, when John Howard was re-elected back in the day, their editorial in the Journal to teachers said, "We've failed to teach young people how to think critically. We've failed to, in our job, to teach kids to think properly, because too many people, young people, voted for John Howard. So they argued, if you're doing your job as an English teacher, kids will always vote for the Democrats or the Labor Party. It's kind of crazy. And, you know, the English teachers now, they even say, and I taught literature for many years, that you can't teach Cinderella if you've got young kids, or Snow White, because the happy ending is a man and a woman being in love. The same as you can't teach Romeo and Juliet, because it privileges love between a man and a woman. So the teacher unions now are pushing this radical gender theory, where everybody has to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, inter, whatever it might be, LGBTQI+. And the latest journal actually said you get rid of pronouns like he and she because they're unfair, and you have to say they instead of he or she.
We've also just recently had an article coming up in the paper in regards to even the name English should not be taught as a subject under that name. It should be given the new name, because that's also racist or privileged and whatever. So people who do that, are they just seeking their 5 minutes of fame, or is it more sinister than that?
Well, I think it's more sinister, and you mentioned that cancel culture book, and I wrote a chapter on education, school education. Jennifer Oriel from The Australian has done one on tertiary universities, and there's a very good chapter by Gary Marks explaining where it all came from. And if you look at the teacher union, if you look at a lot of academics, especially in history or literature, certainly sociology, it is a calculated, what some people call the long march. The left, many years ago, wanted to take control of the media, schools, and you only have to look at the ABC, but the media, schools, universities, and they wanted to take control and project this left-wing ideology, because they do want to denigrate, undermine Western culture, especially the family. And so when I looked at the national curriculum, for example, in 2014, it's even worse now in the latest one. If you look at history, there are 20 or 30 or 40 references to Aboriginal history, and I think there are 2 to Christianity. So if you go through the curriculum, the way they're teaching history now, there's almost nothing about the fact that our parliaments begin with the Lord's Prayer, our constitution refers to God, but they're learning about Aboriginal culture, spirituality. So the left is really taking control and deciding what happens in the classroom. And that to me is a real problem, because we are a Western liberal democracy. That's why we're so free. That's why so many thousands of people want to come and live here, because it's such a good place, and we should defend that and be proud of what we are.
Well, that's one of the things I've noticed. I accidentally subscribed to, I saw an interesting article and I subscribed. It's called Academia, and they keep sending these papers, and I can't believe the number of papers that come out in regards to referencing the Indigenous culture of this country, and basically I think 99 out of 100 of them would sort of be praising the Indigenous culture and sort of condemning white settlement and stuff like that. And I've never found a place where anyone produces papers on things that in regards to our settlement and some of the great achievements we've put. I mean, this is what people don't seem to get. 113 years, less than five generations, people came out here from England, built a nation. If people go to and in Melbourne, if you go up to Sylvania Dam, Monbulk, I think there's a little history, a little society there, a historical society, and you go there and you can see period stuff. But you could also see photographs of people, you know, how they had to clear the land and the conditions they lived under. I mean, that was a Herculean task, and it was probably even worse for settlers in the more outback areas where it was hotter, drier, thirstier, and the hardships there. But there's almost nothing in regards to acknowledging the efforts that were put in by those people to build this country. It's though it's slowly being expunged.
It has, Bill, and it's kind of not there now in what they teach when they teach history and even civics now, the way it's taught. But I mean, my great-great-great-grandfather, Thomas Donnelly, came out 1854 from Ireland, settled in what is now Wagga, and he cleared the land. He had hundreds of acres. He helped build the local convent. He was a good Catholic, and he achieved a great deal in terms of opening up the country, and that's not acknowledged anymore.
It's acknowledged in the fact that he was an environmental vandal.
Well, he was. He stole the land. He stole the land, and he probably poisoned the local people. And that's what I mean. It's all about guilt now. It's all this black armband view of history, as Geoffrey Blaney calls it. But I go back to the First Fleet, and two of the books that came with the First Fleet was the Bible, King James Bible, and another was Blackstone's Laws of England. And what we have to understand is that because we inherited from what is now the United Kingdom, because we inherited Christianity and a common law system and a Westminster form of parliament that evolved over the years so that we now have popular sovereignty, you know, we're now able to elect. It's not perfect, as Winston Churchill says. It's not the most perfect government, but it's the best of the alternatives. But we're no longer teaching that in school. And that's the problem, because you only have to look at what China's doing in the South China Sea. You only have to look at Afghanistan the last couple of weeks. Most of the world is living under dictators, totalitarian regimes. When you look at Australia, America, New Zealand, England, what I call the Anglosphere, we're countries where we have a liberal Western democracy, and generally we're losing it. I mean, we are losing it now, but generally our liberties are protected.
It's been done from internally. That's like we've taken in the Trojan horse in, and they're sort of open the gates to the barbarian sort of thing. So that's the scary part. We're doing it to ourselves.
One of the books I wrote, and it's on my website, about political correctness destroying Australia, I called it Enemies Within and Enemies Without, which is an American expression. So the reality is, in the global environment, internationally, Western democracies are under threat. But at the same time, we're being attacked and undermined within. So things like the ABC are always having a go at liberal values, conservative values. And I think that's appalling. They hated John Howard. They hate Scott Morrison. So they're always having a go undermining what we are as a nation. And that's happening in the classroom as well. And as I said, the fact is we have inherited a very good system. But if each generation is not taught that, if it disappears, it's like the air we breathe. If it goes, it's too late. And that's why, this latest book, Cancel Culture, it's kind of a warning of how bad it's got and what we need to do to make it better.
If we can just move on to the universities for a moment. We had a opportunity recently I'm not sure, was it Ramsey or something? There was supposed to be an opportunity to have a Western history or Western culture facility on a couple of campuses, and that was eventually knocked back by the universities. Is that sort of lack of sort of diversity that's going on in the university, is there any way that can change? Because it's as though it's even things like climate change or that there can't be a dissenting opinion from a lot of things that are there now. Is there hope for us to sort of be able to sort of change that, or has something drastic got to happen to the universities to make them wake up? They've got to be, a centre of learning and debate, not just a think tank or a group think.
It's a real problem, and you mentioned it's the Ramsey Centre, for Western civilization that Paul Ramsey, who left a bequest, wanted to set these up around Australia. And there are at least 3 universities who knocked it back. And at Sydney University, they argued you can't teach Western civilization because that is about white supremacism. It's about colonialisation. It's about oppressing coloured people. So 150 academics signed that. And it's an issue that it's so bad now in terms of what's happening in a lot of these faculties that it's not balanced anymore. It's not impartial anymore. And so as to what you do, I'm not quite sure. One of the things in Sydney, there is the Campion College, which is a liberal arts, as they call it in America. And that's far more balanced. And I know there is a move to try and protect academic freedom, for example, so that if people like me don't conform to the groupthink, we're not indoctrinated, we actually talk, argue what we believe, that we're protected. But it's going to be a long battle, because what the left does, it takes a long-term view. So if you look at communism, if you look at Stalin or Lenin or Mao or Ho Chi Minh, they take a long-term view about what they need to do to win, to have the revolution. I mean, it always turns out to be dictatorial, totalitarian, where millions of people have died or starved or been put in prison. But the left takes that strategic view. Often liberals, I'll call them liberals, conservatives, certainly, we're not as effective as that. So there is a real need in Australia to get motivated. Many years ago, I met Bob Santa Maria, who was head of the National Civic Council, and that was his argument, that the best way to fight the left is to organise and be strategic.
Well, conservative forces aren't very good at getting together. That's what I found. But if we can just go back to the national curriculum, I'm sure a lot of parents would be fairly alarmed in regards to the direction that's gone over the years and the things that are being put to the children. National Curriculum Board, it's independent of the government, but let's face it, the government put it there. I'm sure the government can sort of take it away too. So how do we get different influences onto that curriculum, say from a parent's perspective and what they want for their children, or is that just not included in the discussion? Like, I'm sure most parents would want their children to be able to add, subtract, multiply, also speak out language well, and be knowledgeable. And I suppose the other thing they'd like is for their children to seek more knowledge, because that seems to be one of the problems now. They don't do much investigation, and I think even the older generation are a little bit guilty of it. They just merely read headlines or snippets from news, and that's all the facts that they need. There's no do your own research. So how do the parents now get a say in saying, well, or having opportunity to say, well, this curriculum is not what I want for my children? Or is there no recourse for parents?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's probably almost impossible for parents to be able to influence what happens in terms of the national curriculum, even the state curriculum, whether it's Queensland or Victoria, generally follows the national one. And the problem is it's controlled by so-called experts who aren't really interested in what parents want or what parents think. So I know parents often raise this with me. It is very difficult. And I mean, one of the things I am aware of in Queensland in particular, there's been an increase in homeschooling. And what I mean by that is parents are taking their kids out of school, teaching them at home, getting resources which they think are balanced and fair and more rigorous and more academic. And that's a reasonable approach, because if you're worried that your kids are going to school and they're not getting a good education, a balanced education, then it's pretty drastic, but more and more people are doing that. The other thing is for parents to, be vocal. I mean, get onto your politicians. The national curriculum, the new one, there was a period there for a couple of months over April, May, June, where people could put in submissions. I mean, if enough parents do complain to either politicians or put in submissions, then it might have an impact. But yeah, it's difficult. I mean, my view would be if I had young kids now, I'd be doing a lot of educating at home. And I know that's difficult with two parents often working, and you often don't have the time. But if you were to say to your kids, well, look, here's when they're little, turn the computers off, turn the screens off, we'll sit quietly after dinner for half an hour and I'll read to you, or we'll go over, some history or some music or literature.
A spelling list.
Absolutely. That's a great thing to do.
What about business role? I find that, besides giving a person a good grounding, so they can look after themselves in the future with their education, it's also career oriented. Why isn't business putting out there or putting input into the education system to say, well, this is what we need, skill sets, when people come to us for jobs, and say, well, teaching this, and this isn't going to deliver those skill sets?
Sorry, the wife's calling me to dinner because I'm going on Sky News shortly.
We'll have to wrap it up for you. So do you think there's a role for business to be more vocal in it, to say, well, we need these skill sets to come out with the next generation, and sort of have some input to the curriculum as well?
They do. And over the years, various industrial groups have tried to do that, but they haven't been very effective. I mean, you only have to look at literacy and numeracy. If you look at the international testing, we're going backwards in Australia. And in one test, we're ranked about 24 in terms of countries, in terms of reading and writing. So business does have a role, but to date, they've been very ineffective. Part of the problem is as quite rightly, they're more worried about business matters, whether it's things like apprenticeships or overseas trade or interest rates or whatever it might be, government regulation. and often education isn't really at the front of what they're on about. But certainly they have a role to play. But it's an issue which...
do you think also, because they feel that there's a good rate of immigration in this country, they can pick up those skill sets from immigrants rather than their own? Do you think that they're sort of, oh, well, we can get off the hook anyway because we can get people in from overseas to do the jobs we want? Is that maybe an influence for them as well?
I'm sure it is. And, you know, every year, well, there is obviously, when you've got immigration, there's a criteria, a skilled index. I suppose we're in trouble now because with what I call the China virus or the Wu flu, that's not happening. And so increasingly business is going to have to draw on local people, local kids. And maybe that's a good thing because it'll be a wake-up call that these kids are coming out of 10, 12 years of primary, secondary education and not being up to speed in terms of basic skills. And, you know, could be a wake-up call.
Education actually belongs to the states. In the Constitution, that's one of their things that they're responsible for. But I presume they've handed over a lot of this curriculum thing on the basis, well, the Commonwealth offered them money in lieu of running their own system, sort of thing. Because back in our days, there was a reasonable difference between Western Australia's education system and Victoria's. When we went to school, that was noticeable, and especially noticed it when we changed our children over from one state to another, because I was in the Air Force. So there was these differences. So while it's viable to have some curriculum alignment across the states, but maybe it should be limited to just mathematics, English language, and literacy skills, and science, maybe those core subjects, and the rest should be shoved off to the states to manipulate and come up with their things to try to make their system better than the others and more attractive. Just see a role to cut down the national curriculum's scope.
That was one of the recommendations of the review I did in 2014. And it used to happen during the 70s, 80s. You had a core curriculum and then you had electives. And I argued what the federal government should do would be to move right back, move out of it, and maybe just in the core subjects, say, here's 8 or 10 pages per subject, what you should cover from prep to year 10. And it would be English, mathematics, science to start with. And then the states, and I'd even let the schools work out what the rest should be. And I'm a great believer, with a bit of oversight, letting school communities work out what they want to focus on. Because a school in Melbourne is very different to one in Cairns or in Darwin or in Launceston. So I want to give that flexibility. But Bill, I'm going to have to run.
Yeah. You're going on to Paul Murray's show to talk about similar sort of thing with the national.
That's right, tonight. Yeah.
All the best with that. Thank you for your time tonight, and I hope we can catch you up with you in the near future. Thanks very much.
I'll say goodbye to the dog.
Bye, dog. Right, yeah, Kevin. Thanks very much. I'll talk to you tomorrow. I'll give you a ring.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks very much. If you enjoyed tonight's show, please like, follow, and share. Next week's episode, we'll be having Professor A.J. Brown on. Now, Professor Brown, along with Robbie Catter and Justin Murphy, an economist and commentator for the Australian newspaper, in 2016 had a panel conversation on Late Line regarding the formation of the North Queensland states. Of course, Robbie Catter was in favour, but Professor A.J. Brown and Justin Murphy were lukewarm on the situation. Over the next week, we'll be putting up replaying that panel discussion on the Facebook pages of Brisbane and Regional RAP. And then we'll be following up Regional RAP next week with Professor AJ Brown to see if we can sort of see if he's moderated his feelings about a separate state in the future for North Queensland, and see if I can give him some salient information that might help change his mind. Until then, thanks very much, and we'll see you for the next episode.